So this is just to think about both the design and the aesthetics of your experiments for this flight. Let's see. So yeah, this idea that, and I'm not sure if you can see all of my interface stuff or you can see this clearly, but
we see it clearly.
You do, excellent. So this idea of designing twice, right? You have the experiment to design, but you also have the narrative to tell. And again, this is an hour-long flight. You'll be lucky if you kept some really good footage from the flight. And we have cameras that are already mounted on the walls. I believe, Sean, I don't know if you have the answer to this, but last year I think we set up a bunch of GoPros along the wall to capture the entire flight as much as we could, but you're not kind of guaranteed to be right next to one of those cameras. So thinking about how you are going to document this, what equipment you're going to use, again, the angle and the position of the plane are really important. So this is the telemetron. This is the first telemetron on the left here, just as an example, kind of rendered for, but I think I made business cards of these, but this also came in useful for a lot of the conferences that we ended up speaking at about this project. And so just, be thinking about both the experiment, but also how it's going to be conveyed. So this is an example of Sonar Festival promotion. It's a little bit low res because I blew it up for this slide, but again, this is just a way of presenting the project. It doesn't have to do with the technical aspects, but is a real hook to have conversations like that. And some of them end up in situations like this. And Sheen curates a lot of work for instance, Ars Electronica. We had a number of our projects there. They were seen in a very different context. This is probably the most formal presentation of the telemetron that's happened. One thing that I wanted to talk about is about material choice and thinking about both the functionality and the choice of design and materials that you use to succeed in that way. I personally am a fan, and I guess I'll just, one disclaimer, I'm not going to suggest in this lecture at all that there is like a right way or a wrong way. There are 1,000 different ways to represent projects and 1,000 different aesthetic choices that you can make. So my point here isn't to say like you better make an artsy project. That's not what we're looking for. But for instance, in the telemetron's case, one of the big requirements for the zero gravity flight is safety. And we really wanted to have a clear chamber that you could see inside. We could have done this completely enclosed. We could have done it not in the dodecahedron shape, but that was part of what we were trying to convey with this project and the narrative about it. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make a clear chamber that was safe, but also aesthetically interesting. The shape was related to some theories about the shape of the universe, the geometry of the universe. So there are design influences in here that may not kind of hit you over the head, but are also part of the way that we think about this project. And that concern for safety and for indestructibility ended up with this particular aesthetic, right? We have like a thick enough metal. We had somebody fabricate this metal for us. So thinking about, are you going to need to have somebody else do some fabrication work to accomplish this? Sooner rather than later, obviously, although you should be going through prototyping stages before you get to this point. We did a ton of sketching. We did a ton of just real simple prototyping materials that were cheap and easy to use at first. But what this ended up as is, this aesthetic of so many bolts holding on so that none of them are going to pull out, and a thicker metal and these handles to make sure that we could keep control of it. The functions that we needed resulted in this. And so I wasn't, and I wouldn't suggest that you either just kind of try and put lipstick on a pig, right? Like the design shouldn't be this afterthought where you finish your experiment and you're like, okay, how can we make it look good? It should be part and parcel, and it shouldn't be something that you're just trying to add on after the fact, but something that emerges in parallel as you design your experiment. And that's what happened here. We were pretty happy with the way this came out, and we didn't really plan that it was going to be a bunch of metal and it was going to look very like an engineering project necessarily, but that just naturally came out of what we needed to design. I think everybody should have analogs to what they're designing visually. This is one because I build motorcycles and I think about this a lot. This happens to be one of my big design references that, you know, I use it kind of throughout all of my work, but in the Telemetron, it was definitely a reference. And that you don't need to know anything about motorcycles, but the philosophy behind the design around this particular set of BMW motorcycles is that instead of trying to make something with a bunch of plastic covers over it, like a lot of motorcycles, the idea was that there are mechanics that are necessary. Cooling, for one, is a big concern with motorcycles. And so airflow around these parts that heat up was important. And what their priority was to get rid of anything that's, you know, just artificially going to try and make it look like something, and think about how the construction can actually just convey an aesthetic itself, right? So this is all, you know, this is all metal that's necessary. You can see this kind of exposed frame, but I won't talk about this too much. I just am encouraging you to think even outside of space and find some other visual references that really speak to you and that you appreciate, that you might want to include in your thinking about the aesthetics of your project. And if you think this is all just kind of beside the point and a kind of a waste of time, I would just remind you that you're part of a long tradition of aesthetic choices in space, right? So here are the suits. Before these suits, I heard a story that they had these green kind of army style suits because it was so tied to the military early on, but that they wanted it to look more impressive. And so they literally just spray painted some of those early green suits with silver spray paint. I'm not suggesting you do that, but again, you know, there's a long tradition of necessary aesthetic choices. I may have another example. Yeah. So just in this case, you know, you can see that these cables are wrapped in gold. There's some really good reflectivity, you know, worrying about capturing heat, worrying about infrared. The fact that the suits are white works really well in the context of space when you need to make sure you can see somebody out there. There's a huge contrast between the white suit and the dark of space behind them. So a lot of these things aren't just made to look spacey, right? Like they didn't have that spacey reference back then. They were thinking about what materials they could use for operational purposes, and the aesthetic kind of emerged from that. This is an example of a bad documentation of a project, right? And I've seen this in some of the past projects, and it frustrates me because, you know, the projects can be really impressive, and then they're just photographed, you know, with a coffee cup in the background, or wires, or a trash basket, or, you know. So again, I'm going to encourage you to be taking photographs, filming things. You know, we don't have a video of us assembling the Telemetron, and I would have loved to have had that. You know, we could have done like a, you know, a quick frame rate version so that it happened fast, or, you know, any number of things. But again, I just encourage you, even if you don't think it's going to be useful, just be documenting everything, because you're going to be so glad that you have just a big folder full of material that tells the story about how your project was built before it arrived on the zero-G flight. So here's just it's just another example of some design of spacesuits and of the environment. They're both functional and aesthetic. Just for contrast, like this, I consider at least a slightly better documentation of the Telemetron, and, you know, it has less clutter around it. The objects are the main focus. I probably would have, you know, liked to have not just cut up a piece of like a plastic box and stuffed in our, you know, our receiver board in here and taped it to my laptop, but, you know, can't be perfect. And so if you do end up with projects on a bench with a bunch of things, then they, you know, they better look like this, right? This is a good example of somebody in the science at their bench, you know, doing what they do, but there's a lot of thought put into this. You know, they found somebody who had a good camera, or, you know, somebody that knows how to light things and frame things. So I guess on this point, I would start to, you know, start hitting up your artistic friends if you don't feel like you have those propensities, because just, you know, having somebody else to bounce ideas off of or help you document your project, you'll be happy you did it. And one of the other things, and this is part of the P-set that I'll send along at the end of this, there's this archive of called Spotlight of all of the old MIT features on the homepage. The homepage doesn't quite do this anymore, unfortunately, but they have a huge catalog of all of the ways that science at MIT has been represented, and they're usually very well designed. So I'm going to ask you to go and spend some time in that archive and think about the choices that are made around how to present the work. So for instance, this is a series of pictures of the same exact project, but it's taken at different states along its evolution. You know, things to notice, for instance, would be that there's a black surface underneath this that provides a really beautiful contrast and really allows you to see the geometry of things. That's a dead simple choice that you can make that just really will make the visuals of your project pop, whether it's, you know, in a more stylized image or whether it's on the zero gravity flight. Again, I'd love for you to be thinking about these things in concert with designing your experiment, because I think that it's easy to overlook those things, but it's also easy to be really thinking deeply about them as you go. Just some other examples from Spotlight. You know, close-ups are really nice, and this one really conveys a lot of the technical detail of it and the kind of impressive aspects of this project without really showing much more than like a very small subsection. Again, close-ups are nice. You know, your choice of materials is really going to shine when you have this type of documentation. This is a nice example of like really, it's probably acrylic, but like a really nice close-up that again tells the story. It's another close-up. Some of the circuits, you know, are really small, but if you know, the lighting in the shot's beautiful. Somebody spent some time in Photoshop to actually really try and convey this. There's the depth of field here, so that everything in the background is blurry. So if you can avoid just taking, you know, shots with your iPhone, to the extent that you have access to some of that equipment, again, beg, borrow, and steal. I think we can help do that around the lab, and we also have a connection with Jimmy from the video production unit at the Media Lab. And from what I've heard, he's still actually willing to do that stuff in a socially distanced and safe way, even, you know, around campus or what have you. This is just another one that's not such a close-up, but is still a really nice documentation of something. There's no distraction. The object of interest is primary right here. Even, you know, the fact that they labeled each of those things, you know, they had to choose a font for that. They had to choose a color. These are all decisions that you can be thinking about. I love this one. This is our friends who do a zero gravity band. I think I've mentioned them before. This keyboard that you saw off to the left-hand side, they brought because you can't use a regular piano. But when they went to turn the dial, the entire piano turned around in their hands. So yeah. Again, there's just so many kind of hidden surprises and things to learn in microgravity. So look for those opportunities. But this is a really nice fisheye lens of, you know, that also kind of occludes everything else that's going on in the flight. Here are a couple of Media Lab examples of projects that I consider good documentation. Of course, Sheen made this beautiful device and probably could have realized this in a less beautiful way. And this is the first project that she flew that would fire out a magnet onto the wall so that you can actually pull yourself out if you get stuck in the center of zero gravity and you can't grab onto anything. And of course, you can't swim to the walls. So I like how she's documented this. Jonathan Barbaro is another ex-Media Labber who is really good. In this case, he chose to take a picture when he hadn't removed the support material off of his 3D prints, and it's really conveys a lot more than if he had just taken those parts as is and laid them on a table and taken a picture of them. And maybe one of my favorite documentation jobs for zero gravity flight is Spatial Flux by Chris Ula and Carson. So this is just one example here, but I believe I have a video that they made. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Now, can you all see my web browser right now?
Not currently, no.
I'm going to, I think I just have to share my whole screen here. There's all of you. Here we go. So they took, maximize this, the time-lapse video of their production process. And I really love this. And there's a shot at the end of this video that I want to make a couple of comments on, but I'll just play this. It's only 40 seconds here. So again, this is just a picture, or sorry, just a table in their lab. And they made sure nobody was in the background. They picked a good angle, and they just did what they needed to do the fabrication. Highly recommend going and checking out this project. So there's just a kind of a pan of the final project, and then one on the zero gravity flight once they actually deployed it. Okay, so let me pause this. There's a couple of things that happen at the end here that I'm really proud of them for that may not be obvious. So here, I'll turn off the sound. Couple of things. For one, the camera angle is great, right? Like they planned this ahead of time, that they knew that this is the angle that they wanted to get on it. And they did that well. One thing you'll notice is that the camera tracks upwards as the experiment tracks upwards. You see both the experiment kind of playing out and the participants, the designers. That didn't just happen because somebody was holding the camera and did that perfectly. Nobody was holding that camera at all. They actually built the camera mount onto the hinge such that as this phenomenon happened, you get a great bit of documentation. And I think that's a really great example of some really simple thought that you can put into how you're going to document things that just really kind of, yeah, it goes a long way. One other detail is that you'll notice that it goes into slow motion here. And so if you have cameras, or if you can acquire cameras that are capable of this, then let me switch back to this. And an iPhone can do that. So you can be recording in slow motion and have that switch happen. It doesn't take really advanced camera work. We actually got a decent camera that could do a faster frame rate for our last flight, and we were happy that we did. All of this is to say that there are some pretty nuanced ways that you can choose to document your project. And yeah, this last comment here. It's okay if everything isn't white. This slide is not intended to suggest that everything needs to be completely stark. One great example, of course, is Sheen's work. And this is probably the example of like how far documentation has been taken for projects. She actually hired a photographer that was willing to shoot underwater. I believe that they actually layered the background with some black plastic, though I'm not sure. But just to great success. And depending on how important it is to convey your story aesthetically, you can go really far. Screenshots, again, I'll just point out here. So for instance, this was the circuit board that we were designing for the last telemetron round. And we were taking screenshots constantly because these things become slides. They become really useful ways to talk about your project. And there are aesthetics that might seem throwaway at the time, but actually are pretty good visual material to convey to people. Sketches, again, this is one of the really early sketches that we made of the original telemetron. And, I mean, I won't get into like artist references, but for instance, I was just learning about Annie Albers and how she only made 45 works in her entire artistic career, but spent nearly a year doing diagrams and really, really planning things through. And obviously, we don't have that type of time, and you have operational concerns. But again, just be sketching. It doesn't have to be pretty. This isn't a particularly pretty drawing, but it really does, is part of the narrative. Again, we did some really quick 3D models of things to send to 0G. These things got included in the RPP, and it was clear documentation that greased the rails for us to, appear. I mean, we did we did know what we were talking about, and we were rigorous about it. But I wouldn't have included something like this in there. But this it's clear that we've kind of thought through things. And we can talk about materials and acquiring those materials. This is the acrylics plastic store that I use, but we actually weren't able to use acrylic because, of course, acrylic shatters really easily. And if we they wouldn't have approved our project if we hadn't used polycarb instead of acrylic, because there's a risk of shattering, there's a risk of little pieces flying and hurting somebody else. Things get kind of lodged in the corners. I think they lost some keys for the better part of a year in there until they just popped out randomly one day. But be thinking about your materials in that way, and be thinking about safety in that way. There are, variously more expensive materials that might be colored that might add like a pop. Thinking about color in terms of function is nice too. Like if there are a couple of items that are important to pay attention to or to tell your story visually when you're talking about the project after the fact, that can also be functional to kind of like be easy to see on your experiment while you're using it, then those choices can be made intentionally. This is us with Jimmy doing some photography to try and get us the sense of the object floating, because again, it's very hard to get stylized shots in zero gravity flight. It's chaotic. I will continue to say it just like Sheen did. Watch some of the videos in real time and you'll see just how quickly things happen. And some of our shots are in slow motion that I'm really happy with. And it's just so much more compelling than, like 15 seconds of us scrambling and floating around and losing control and falling back down. So we got, there's a bottom right example of some nice close-ups, and we photoshopped out this wire to get this sense of it. I think, I don't have it on here, but we kind of put our hands into the shot to give a sense of perspective and size. So this is an option if you want to go this far. And then of course we've got the photographer on the flight with us. Sean, we have the same photographers the last couple times, is that right?
I do not know. I can find out though.
Okay, we've contracted him the last few times, and he's done, I think, over 400 zero gravity flights. His deal is he's a photographer for zero gravity flights. So he knows how to move around really easily. He kind of knows what to expect and knows some really good shots to get. Like our last flight, I heard him suggesting that somebody, flip upside down to really get the sense that you're floating. And I think you'll be really happy if you think about those things as well. Once you get the pictures back. This one I'm pretty happy with. It's like kind of possible to tell that that thing is floating above both of our hands. Both of our feet are kind of cropped out and on the floor. But there are great examples of how great this can look, and just how you can make it very clear that you're in the environment of microgravity doing this work. And so here's a better one of us with Nicole just kind of hanging off of the wall and performing with the telemetron. Let's see. Oh yeah, there we go. So this is the promo video that we made, and it's, GoPros are easy to acquire, but with the harsh lighting in the flight, you end up with some fairly grainy work. You can see it pretty well here. So we just, we did a bunch of selecting clips and pieced them together and put some of the music that we recorded on the flight over this. I can just skip to the end here. Yeah, just some, again, good videos. Try and make sure that your hands aren't on the thing, because now you can see that your experiment is if you're doing a free float experiment, it's kind of nice. So planning some of these shots is nice. Let's see. Yeah, anyways, I think you point there. Oops. Back in here. Okay, I'm almost done, and then I'd love for us to just kind of reflect on this together. This is a diagram that somebody else made of the telemetron for a conference. We didn't even ask them to. So it's just another example of how these things might be conveyed without having to get like the perfect photo shot of them. And then Annie Lou's project, she's just fantastic at documenting things. So this is on our first zero gravity flight, where she took some really beautiful and artistic, well-framed pictures of these olfactory time capsules, where she had a scent that was of Earth, and to, speculatively for people to take up into space with them so that they could still smell that smell of Earth in this very antiseptic environment. Another one, go check out her work. Another one was from the smell of her husband that she synthesized from the armpit after he worked out in a shirt. Her work's fantastic. But maybe the thing to note here is that this is largely a non-interactive project other than smelling this, but she was still able to make some really successful documentation of these. And there are pictures of her smelling it on the flight that are fantastic as well. But yeah, be thinking about all of the different ways you might document things along the way. Ariel's done a great job. This is actually quite out of date right now. I don't know if any of you saw her presentation. I'm sure she'd share slides and videos from it, but she's done a really good job in this case of both showing some of the technical details that she captured along the way, as well as this unfolding narrative of exactly what the project is supposed to do. And then again, I remind you to go read our article that's linked from the Space Exploration Initiative's homepage on the Media Lab site about how we're democratizing access to space and the language that we use around that. And I would encourage you to think about how your project might accomplish those goals as well. For the Telemetron project, while we can't bring people up there with us because it's cost prohibitive, we are making an open hardware platform so that other people can stand on our shoulders in terms of, not having to design an entire circuit board that integrates an IMU and a radio transmission unit, for instance. So we can be democratizing access to space by building things and intentionally making them open from the beginning, so that other people can then go on and do even more fascinating work with it. I think that's it. Oh yeah, here's my maybe slightly aggressive recommendation to you that you really should be kind of thinking broadly at this point about what your experiment is going to look like, how you're going to document it. I think you're going to learn a lot throughout the next couple of months. And for you to be thinking about the design and aesthetic choices of it alongside the engineering choices is I think critical to a well-documented project. So here's the P set. It's pretty lightweight as far as P sets go, but I would like you to spend as much time as you can in the Spotlight archive, spotlight.mit.edu. Scan around. It's broken up into months and years, but you can use the arrow key to just tab through all of them. And there's a bunch of profile shots in there where it's just a picture of the researcher, but I would focus on the ones that actually look at the materiality of the science that's going on. And they're just really good examples of how there are compelling ways to tell stories about these things. And if you imagine your work to be on the MIT homepage or on the cover of Wired or whatever your goals are, making these choices early on can set you up for success in that aspect. So number two, I want you all to kind of create an inspiration board of visual and or other references, not just pulling from that Spotlight archive, but I'm encouraging you to go into other fields that are unrelated to your work or unrelated to space. Or related to space is fine, but what I would like you to do is put together just, maybe like an 11 by 17 of visual influences or aspirations. So, go and find something and be like, yeah, that project. I love how that project is presented. That inspires me. I would like my project to do that same work. And put those together. And then we can, I'm happy to spend time kicking those around with people and coming up with brainstorming other references and influences.
How would
number
you?
Three, yeah.
So if I may ask briefly,
Please.
how would you? What kind of format would you expect, like a Google Doc or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's as simple as a Google Doc is fine. Microsoft Paint is fine. Like just make a document where you include a bunch of images that are visual references. For some of you, visual isn't the primary way that you want to represent this, and that's fine, but I would think about other projects that have been successful in similar ways. And I think you'll be surprised at how much you can get out of just finding a couple of really, projects that speak to you. So because it's hard to make all of your engineering decisions at the same time as thinking of okay, now I have to think about all these, visual conditions and materials, etc. But sometimes just finding the right set of inspirations can answer a bunch of those things for you, whether it's a color palette or materials or what have you. That can be a real nice shortcut way to make some intelligent and informed design considerations and decisions along the way. And then the final one, just write up a list of right now what photographic equipment, lighting, et cetera, you're planning on doing it. That can be, is everything from I'm including 3 LEDs on my project to light it, all the way up to I have a high frame rate camera that I'm planning on acquiring or borrowing for the flight. And again, that doesn't have to be during the flight. It can be, pre and post. But I want you to think through these things now, because it'll allow you to think about what you need to wrangle earlier, and also it'll help you you'll be glad that you've made these decisions ahead of time, so you don't have to worry about them later on.